Another discussion of expanding Medicaid in the state of Wyoming. And if you want more information on that and whether it's good for Wyoming or bad, then you turn to a group like Wyoming Liberty Group. There, that was your commercial. How'd I do?
You did good. Good
Okay,
morning,
thanks.
Glenn.
Good
How are you?
morning. Because you have to take a look at how it's worked for other states and then how it would work for the state of Wyoming. So what have you found so far?
I'm very concerned about the federal cost sharing. The whole reason that the Revenue Committee is even considering this is because some people have led them to believe that the federal government will pay 90% of this. And so that cost sharing means Wyoming is leaving money on the table, essentially, is how they're selling it. But there's a few problems with that. The first is that we still, even under the best case scenario, would have to pay 10%. And we don't know where that money is going to come from. And at the Revenue Committee meeting, they discussed maybe having to make some cuts somewhere else to cover that cost. And that would include cutting mental health or substance abuse care, things that have already been significantly sliced in the past. And the second problem, that cost-sharing equation isn't permanent. The federal government can change that. They don't always have to cover 90%. Most people think at some point in the near future it'll go down to 50-50, and then you're looking at an even bigger piece of the pie that we're going to have to pay for, and we don't even know how many people are going to enroll. In other states that have expanded, you've seen over-enrollment where people move into the state or flood the state for care. And so all those estimated numbers have skyrocketed. And the third problem, the last problem I see from a revenue standpoint, is we can't opt out of this. There's been some discussion that, if that cost-sharing equation changes, we'll just get out. And we've looked into that and talked to other states, and that's a very hard process to do, and some people think it can't be done.
But let's talk about the cost sharing as far as what the federal government says they will give. So there's what they initially give. Am I wrong? I've looked at other states, and it looks to me like what they were initially promised, they in most cases don't get the whole thing. The federal government just keeps scaling it back. Am I right about that?
Yeah, that's true, and that's what happens when you hitch your horse to something that's trillions of dollars in debt, right?
Right.
And you can't count on that paycheck. So, yeah, you're exactly spot on.
Okay, well, and we just hit $23 trillion. We just crossed over that milestone. So at some point, the federal government is going to have to start looking at things like this. Now, isn't it also the case that Medicaid itself, as a federal program, is hitting some financial problems just because they've allowed too many people into the program?
Oh, yeah, and you're seeing that expand. There was a news article just yesterday, I believe it was in Wisconsin. Their Supreme Court ruled that now Medicaid needs to cover required gender reconstructive surgeries under their Medicaid policy. And so you're seeing instances like that because when you start applying constitutional principles to this access to health care issue, it's hard to really stop that ball from rolling. Whereas when it's privatized to a certain extent and you keep Medicaid only for the extremely poor, which it was designed to be, then you don't have that problem. But yeah, you're seeing states who can't even control now what's being paid for and how much money is being paid out.
Well, now, you also mentioned, we don't really know, because I keep hearing numbers, it's going to help this many people in Wyoming. But from what I've seen, when I look at other states, don't these other states often get a lot more people showing up to take advantage of what people see as free than originally was forecast? I mean, far more. It overwhelms the system. Illinois is one of the best examples.
Yeah, you're exactly right about that too, Glenn. You're seeing what they call over-enrollment, and then you're seeing crowding out issues. And that's a whole other topic. But one thing that's extremely problematic from states I've looked at is you really don't have to show a whole lot to get Medicaid in a state. You have to show an intent to move there. And the theory is that you want health care the minute you arrive. So because of that, though, there's not a lot of requirements. And so people are able to kind of doctor shop over state lines and try to get Medicaid to cover it. And so it's extremely problematic because you also have people who aren't residents necessarily getting health care in your state, and it makes it very hard to see a doctor. I mean, you've heard in all of these countries, Canada being one example, it makes it hard to get in to see a doctor.
Well, then we have the next problem. Speaking of doctors, you and I both know several around the state of Wyoming who have made the case that the doctors don't get paid through Medicaid enough to cover the cost of taking care of the patient. Because when you got, let's say, an independent doctor, we can go to the hospital, that's a problem there too, but let's say an independent doctor. So there's the cost of running the office every day. There's the rent on the office, there's insurance, there's employees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Medicaid comes in and does not pay that full cost when someone wants to pay through Medicaid. That means the doctor ends up a little short. That's not good for business.
Exactly. And that's why it was so ironic that at the Revenue Committee meeting, all the UW medical students, a whole gaggle of them, showed up to testify about how they were in support of it. And I think they came from a good place, but, Dr. Hellman, who sits on that committee, he's a retired physician, and he was pretty blunt about telling them, this doesn't work when you do dollars to donuts. It seems like a good idea. It seems like you would want to help people that perhaps weren't getting health care, but let's take a step back here and kind of set the record straight on that. I think that's an interesting issue, and keep in mind that those medical students haven't made it out into the real world yet to open up their clinics and realize that the Medicaid billing rate will bankrupt them and that they won't be able to pay their student loans, and what's the point in becoming a doctor if you can't make any money? So I think there's a lot of issues that weren't considered. And the press had that testimony as being so impactful and swaying the committee, and I don't think that that was the case. I think that the committee had made up their mind before that they were going to let it hit the floor. I think there were a few people who had flipped their votes, and I think they're going to give it the courtesy and the discussion so that perhaps the governor could have more of a say in it. He said it's something that he'd be willing to look at. See what happens in the session, but
right. Well, now, it seems
definitely
to me,
not a good revenue topic.
No, well, it seems to me that this governor, where the last governor was in favor of it, in fact, even in a couple of his State of the State addresses, Governor Meade said, we need to do this for the state of Wyoming. This governor, however, he's willing to listen, but so far he's been opposed to it. So it looks like we'll have the discussion, but I wish you and I had a crystal ball. It hits the floor, goes how far? Because so far, every time Medicaid expansion has ended up on the floor in the House, it's died there. It hasn't gone past that. It barely got out of committee. It died on the floor. If it makes to the governor, I wonder if he'll even veto it.
I don't know.
Yeah.
To be honest, I don't know what he'll do, but I think that when you look at his other statements about trimming up spending before we start looking at taxes, which is great, and fiscal conservation, I think that this definitely doesn't fall into that category because we're definitely going to be on the hook for something. But the problem with it is it can be easily sold as a humanitarian type thing, which frustrates me because we're talking about people who do have jobs and who do make a working living wage and just think that the cost of health care is too high, which is really a national problem that Wyoming can't be shoehorned into fixing with state money we don't have. And the other big thing for me, Obamacare is up on appeal to the Supreme Court, and so we're going to quickly learn whether or not that's constitutional at all and needs to be restructured. And my guess is that we're going to start seeing a lot more open borders to where you can start shopping across state lines for health care again so that we can increase that market and health care costs will go down. So I think this is a national problem that's going to solve itself sooner rather than later. And opting into a program we can't opt out of when we don't know what we're going to be on the hook for is not a good idea.
Well, and you never want to enter a contract where you are stuck with what you signed, but the other party can change any detail they want anytime they want. That's not a good contract.
It's called a contract of adhesion, and usually they're illegal except for when it's the federal government, and then it's okay.
See, Cassie's a lawyer, so she knows that term. So you're writing about this, and people need to see the articles and the information you're coming up with. Where do they find your work?
Whyliberty.org. And we are working on a series of literature that really brings this down to a base level to where normal people who don't live in the policy world with their nose in a book can understand kind of what's going on and how it impacts them. Because I think there's some confusion around that. And we're also probably going to put on an event sooner rather than later, do some kind of panel on this and really get the word out so that people can come.
Okay. Cassie, thanks for coming on the program this morning. I appreciate it. Speaking of doctors that know all about this, John is on the phone with me. Good morning, John.
Hey, good morning, Glenn. You know, the biggest, I think, critical difference between the states and the federal government in implementing Medicaid is the federal government can print money and the states can't.
Right.
So, for example, in Ohio, now that their Medicaid expansion is almost 40% of their whole state budget, they have nothing they can do about it other than shrink the departments of education and transportation and law enforcement. The feds just print more money.
Sure. Now, that goes back to what Cassie was saying. I didn't know about this, and I got to ask her again, what do you call that kind of a contract? Which, by the way, is an illegal contract, but the federal government can do it, where the state signs their end of the contract and is stuck with it, but the federal government can change any rule anytime they want. So, of course, it doesn't work out for the states.
Well, that's actually a standard insurance contract any hospital or doctor has with insurance companies because they change their rules of reimbursement quarterly with no prior warning. So that's fairly standard in healthcare. The government's just doing what all the insurance companies are doing.
I guess. Okay. All right. Well, while I have you here real quick, since I brought this up. So from a doctor's point of view, it doesn't work for the doctor's office. Why?
It doesn't cover the cost of what it costs us to actually take care of the patient, and we want to take care of the patient. But since 1986, we've been spreading Medicare and Medicaid so thin, they've lowered the reimbursement to the point that we can't sustain business operations and take care of the folks. It's not a matter of profit anymore. It's a matter of existence.
And I guess that's why more and more doctors are just refusing to accept it in the first place. They as a business model, they just can't.
And it just breaks our heart because our core mandate in ourselves is we want to take care of people.
So there's a problem that needs to be solved as far as those who needed to see a doctor and can't afford it. But this current model for doing it is just not going to work. That's the takeaway I get.
Unfortunately, no, but there are other options.
Meantime, I want to get right to Joel and Casper. He's been hanging patiently, and I appreciate that, Joel. So you want to talk about Medicaid as well?
Good morning. Yeah. Hey, just quick, you mentioned Illinois, and I hail from there originally. And
right.
In the first part of my adult life, I was a medical clinician myself in EMS. I was a paramedic for over 20 years. But I have a good friend who, we go all the way back to grade school together, and he is an oral maxillofacial and plastic surgeon. And he jumped the border, and he now lives in Iowa, but he has his own building, surgery center, several surgeons there, and they do all sorts of different specialties. But the point of the call is he puts faces back together. And a lot of those are cleft palates, and he gets a lot of Medicaid kids from Illinois. And what I was going to tell you and what the emotional medical students need to know is he doesn't even charge them because Illinois paid 11 cents on the dollar for facial reconstruction, and when it came to the administrative costs and anesthesia, and he was losing money. So, he's a committed, he's a committed healer, and he loves his craft. But he just finally, and I talk to him once a month. We have been in contact forever, and we talk about this stuff all the time. And he just simply got to the point where he's like, I just fix them. He goes, it's just not worth it. He said that it's just such a mess. And they come in, and on the average, it was 11 cents on the dollar. And he said, it's cheaper for me just to fix their face and get them through their convalescence, and then send them on their way. He goes, because the bureaucracy said he was losing money. And that's what a lot of these medical students and young physicians, and of course, just the left side of the political argument don't get is this is a service industry. I tweet to Bernie all the time, hey, when do I get my free plumbing and house contracting and free electrical work? These are service industries. They can't be a right. People in the business, treat and take care of people because that's what we do. And of course, we just let the bureaucracy take care of the payment down the road. But the fact of the matter is we've been forced to give away so much free medicine that every hospital in the country darn near is working in the red, and that's what the exponential cost a rise in cost of medical care over the last 40, 50 years has been caused from, is because the hospitals and the facilities are trying to make up for the bad debt, and then the insurance companies, came out and said, hey, we're not going to pay, I got my client, I'll pay his bills, but I'm not going to pay for the bad debt. So that's where the 80-20 plans came up. It's just a cycle of diminishing result, and it has turned into a mess over, 4 or 5 decades now.
It makes sense to me that anybody turns and says, we need to help these people who can't afford to take care of some really important medical needs. Hey, I want to help them too, but like Dr. John said in the last phone call, there's other ways to do this that actually work. For those people who immediately turn to the government and say, well, we'll just make a government solution. Well, you see how that always turns out. There's other ways. This is why I love things like the Children's Miracle Network, organizations like that.
There's that physician down in Wichita who's doing that concierge service, and he, too, has built a big center. And I can't remember his name. Hannity talks about him all the time, has him on his show. But he's gotten to the point where he gives people their prescriptions, and X-rays cost $5, and he basically does everything, and his patients carry a major medical in the event of a car accident or something.
Mm-hmm.
But just generic, everyday medical care and kid care and family practice is just taken care of through his facility, and that includes like bones and everything. So you break your arm, you got a couple $5 X-rays, and then your major medical will take care of if it has to be surgically repaired or what have you. Then you go into the hospital and whatever.
Yeah. See, that's what happens when the free market takes care of it rather than politicians. See, politicians don't know about medicine. That's why they can't make a system that works. Bureaucrats don't know about the medical industry. That's why they can't make a system that works. But those people who are actually in your industry can develop a system that works. We should leave it up to them.
Right.